Fourth Iteration, Part 2. Tim. Tim Murphy lay in the Land Cruiser, his cheek pressed against the car door handle. He drifted slowly back to consciousness. He wanted only to sleep. He shifted his position and felt the pain in his cheekbone where it lay against the metal door. His whole body ached. His arms and his legs, and most of all, his head. There was a terrible pounding pain in his head. All the pain made him want to go back to sleep. He pushed himself up on one elbow, opened his eyes, and retched, vomiting all over his shirt. He tasted sour bile and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His head throbbed. He felt dizzy and seasick, as if the world were moving, as if he were rocking back and forth on a boat. Tim groaned and rolled onto his back, turning away from the puddle of vomit. The pain in his head made him breathe in short, shallow gasps, and he still felt sick, as if everything were moving. He opened his eyes and looked around, trying to get his bearings. He was inside the Land Cruiser, but the car must have flipped over on its side, because he was lying on his back against the passenger door, looking up at the steering wheel and beyond, at the branches of a tree moving in the wind. The rain had nearly stopped, but water drops still fell on him through the broken front windshield. He stared curiously at the fragments of glass. He couldn't remember how the windshield had broken. He couldn't remember anything except that they had been parked on the road and he had been talking to Dr. Grant when the Tyrannosaur came toward them. That was the last thing he remembered. He felt sick again and closed his eyes until the nausea passed. He was aware of the rhythmic creaking sound, like the rigging of a boat. Dizzy and sick to his stomach, he really felt as if the whole car were moving beneath him. But when he opened his eyes again, he saw it was the Land Cruiser was moving, lying on its side, swaying back and forth. The whole car was moving. Tentatively, Tim rose to his feet, standing on the passenger door. He peered over the dashboard, looking through the shattered windshield. At first, he saw only dense foliage, moving in the wind, but here and there he could see gaps, and beyond the foliage, the ground was 20 feet below him. He stared uncomprehendingly. The Land Cruiser was lying on its side in the branches of a large tree, 20 feet above the ground, swaying back and forth in the wind. "Oh, shit," he said. "What was he going to do?" He stood on his tiptoes and peered out, trying to see better, grabbing the steering wheel for support. The wheel spun free in his hand, and with a loud crack, the Land Cruiser shifted position, dropping a few feet in the branches of a tree. He looked down through the shattered glass of the passenger door window on the ground below. "Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit," he kept repeating it. "Oh shit, oh shit." Another loud crack. The Land Cruiser jolted down another foot. He had to get out of here. He looked down at his feet. He was standing on the door handle. He crouched back down on his hands and knees to look at the handle. He couldn't see very well in the dark, but he could tell that the door was dented outward so the handle couldn't turn. He'd never get the door open. He tried to roll the window down, but the window was stuck too. Then he thought of the back door. Maybe he could open that. He leaned over the front seat, and the Land Cruiser lurched with the shift and weight. Carefully, Tim reached back and twisted the handle of the rear door. It was stuck too. How was he going to get out? He heard a snorting sound and looked down. A dark shape passed below him. It wasn't the Tyrannosaur. This shape was tubby, and it made a kind of snuffling as it waddled along. The tail flopped back and forth, and Tim couldn't see the long spikes. It was a stegosaur, apparently recovered from its illness. Tim wondered where the other people were. Gennaro and Sadler and the vet. He had last seen them near the stegosaur. How long ago was that? He looked at his watch, but the face was cracked. He couldn't see the numbers. He took the watch off and tossed it aside. The stegosaur snuffled and moved on. Now the only sound was the wind in the trees and the creaking of the Land Cruiser as it shifted back and forth. He had to get out of there. Tim grabbed the handle, tried to force it, but it was stuck solid. It wouldn't move at all. Then he realized what was wrong. The rear door was locked. Tim pulled up the pin and twisted the handle. The rear door swung open, downward, and came to the rest against the branch of a few feet below. The opening was narrow, but Tim thought he could wriggle through it. Holding his breath, he crawled slowly back into the rear seat, and the Land Cruiser creaked but held its position. Gripping the doorposts on both sides, Tim slowly lowered himself down. Through the narrow-angled opening of the door, soon he was lying flat on his stomach on a slanted door, his legs sticking out of the car. He kicked in the air, his feet touched something solid, a branch, and he rested his weight on it. As soon as he did, the branch bent down and the door swung wider, spilling him out of the Land Cruiser, and he fell, leaves scratching his face and body, bouncing from branch to branch, a jolt of searing pain, bright light in his head. He slammed to a stop. The wind knocked from him. Tim lay doubled over a large branch, his stomach burning pain. Tim heard another crack and stood up at the Land Cruiser, a big dark shape 5 feet above him. Another crack. The car shifted. Tim forced himself to move, to climb down. He used to like to climb trees. He was a good tree climber. And this was a good tree to climb. The branches spaced close together, almost like a staircase. Crack! The car was definitely moving. Tim scrambled downward, slipping over the wet branches, feeling sticky sap on his hands, hurrying. He had not descended more than a few feet when the Land Cruiser creaked the final time, and then slowly, very slowly, nosed over. Tim could see the big green grill and the front headlights swinging down at him, and then the Land Cruiser fell free, gaining momentum as it rushed toward him, slamming against the branch where Tim had just been. And it stopped. His face just inches from the dented grill, bent inward like an evil mouth. Headlamps for eyes, oil dripped on Tim's face. He was still 12 feet above the ground. He reached down, found another branch, and moved down. Above, he saw the branch bending under the weight of the Land Cruiser, and then it cracked. The Land Cruiser came rushing down toward him, and he knew he would never escape it. He could never get it down fast enough, so Tim just let go. He fell the rest of the way, tumbling, banging, feeling pain in every part of his body, hearing the Land Cruiser smashing down through the branches after him like a pursuing animal. And then Tim's shoulder hit the soft ground, and he rolled as hard as he could, and pressed his body against the trunk of the tree as the Land Cruiser tumbled down with a loud metallic crash and a sudden hot burst of electrical sparks that stung his skin and sputtered and sizzed on the wet ground around him. Slowly, Tim got to his feet. In the darkness he heard the snuffling, and saw the stegosaur coming back, apparently attracted by the crash of the Land Cruiser. The dinosaur moved dumbly, the low head thrust forward, and the big cartilaginous plates running in 2 rows along the hump of the back. It behaved like an overgrown tortoise, stupid like that, and slow. Tim picked up a rock and threw it. "Get away!" The rock thunked dully off the plates. The stegosaur kept coming. "Go on! Go!" He threw another rock and hit the stegosaur in the head. The animal grunted, turned slowly away, and shuffled off in the direction it came. Tim leaned against the crumpled Land Cruiser and looked around the darkness. He had to get back to the others, but he didn't want to get lost. He knew he was somewhere in the park, probably not far from the main road. If he could only get his bearings. He couldn't see much in the dark, but then he remembered the goggles. He climbed through the shattered front windshield of the Land Cruiser and found the night vision goggles and the radio. The radio was broken and silent, so he left it behind. But the goggles still worked. He flicked them on, saw the reassuringly familiar phosphorescent green image. Wearing the goggles, he saw the battered fence off to his left and walked toward it. The fence was 12 feet high, but the Tyrannosaur had flattened it easily. Tim hurried across it, moved through the area of dense foliage, and came out to the main road. Through his goggles, he saw the other Land Cruiser turned on its side. He ran toward it, took a breath, and looked inside. The car was empty, no sign of Dr. Grant or Dr. Malcolm. Where had they gone? Where had everybody gone? He felt sudden panic. Standing alone in the jungle road at night with that empty car, turned quickly in circles, seeing the bright green world in the goggles swirl. Something pale by the side of the road caught his eye. It was Lex's baseball. He wiped the mud off of it. "Lex!" Tim shouted as loud as he could, not caring if the animals heard him. He listened, but there was only the wind and the plink of raindrops falling from the trees. "Lex!" He vaguely remembered that she had been in the Land Cruiser when the Tyrannosaur attacked. Had she stayed there? Or had she gotten away? The events of the attack were confused in his mind. He wasn't exactly sure what had happened. Just to think of it made him uneasy. He stood in the road, gasping with panic. "Lex!" The night seemed to close in around him. Feeling sorry for himself, he sat in a cold, rainy puddle in the road and whimpered for a while. When he finally stopped, he still heard whimpering. It was faint, and it was coming from somewhere farther up the road. "How long has it been?" Muldoon said, coming back to the control room. He was carrying a black metal case. "Half an hour. Harding's Jeep should be back here by now." Arnold stubbed out his cigarette. "I'm sure they'll arrive any minute now." "Still no sign of Nedry?" Muldoon said. "No, not yet." Muldoon opened the case, which contained 6 portable radios. "I'm going to distribute these to people in the building." He handed one to Arnold. "Take the charger too. These are emergency radios, but nobody had them plugged in. Naturally, let it charge about 20 minutes and they'll try to raise the cars." Henry Wu opened the door marked fertilization and entered the darkened lab. There was nobody there. Apparently, all the technicians were still at dinner. Wu went directly to the computer terminal and punched up the DNA logbooks. The logbooks had been kept on the computer. DNA was a large molecule that each species required 10 gigabytes of optical disk space to store details of all the iterations. He was going to have to check all 15 species. That was a tremendous amount of information to search through. He still wasn't clear about why Grant thought frog DNA was important. Wu himself didn't often distinguish one kind of DNA from another. After all, most DNA in living creatures was exactly the same. DNA was an incredibly ancient substance. Human beings walking around in the streets of the modern world, bouncing their pink new babies, hardly stopped to think that the substance at the center around it all, the substance that began the dance of life, was a chemical almost as old as the Earth itself. The DNA molecule was so old that its evolution had essentially finished more than 2 billion years ago. There had been little new since that time. Just a few recent combinations of the old genes and not much of that. When you compare the DNA of man and the DNA of lowly bacterium, you'll find that only 10% of the strands were different. This innate conservatism of DNA emboldened Wu to use whatever DNA he wished. In making his dinosaurs, Wu had manipulated the DNA as a sculptor might clay or marble. He had created freely. He started the computer search program, knowing it would take 2 or 3 minutes to run. He got up and walked around the lab, checking instruments out of long-standing habit. He noted the recorder outside the freezer door, which tracked the freezer temperature. He saw there was a spike in the graph. That was odd, he thought. It meant somebody had been in the freezer recently, to within the last half hour. But who would go there at night? The computer beeped, signaling that the first of the data searches was complete. Wu went over to see what he had found, and when he saw the screen, he forgot all about the freezer and the graph spike. Leitzi DNA search algorithm. DNA version search criteria RANA, all fragment less than 0. DNA incorporating RANA fragments, versions. Mysosaurs 2.1 through 2.9. Proconsovnithids 3.0 through 3.7. Othnilia 3.1 to 3.3. Velociraptors 1.0 to 3.0. Hypsilophodontids 2.4 to 2.7. The result was clear. All breeding dinosaurs incorporated RANA, or frog DNA. None of the other animals did. Wu still did not understand why this caused them to breed. But he could no longer deny that Grant was right. The dinosaurs were breeding. He hurried up to the control room. Lex. She was curled up inside a big 1-meter drainage pipe that ran under the road. She had her baseball glove in her mouth and she was rocking back and forth, banging her head repeatedly against the back of the pipe. It was dark in there, but he could see her clearly with his goggles. She seemed unhurt, and he felt a great burst of relief. "Lex! It's me, Tim!" She didn't answer. She continued to bang her head on the pipe. "Come on out!" She shook her head no. He could see she was badly frightened. "Lex," he said, "if you come out, I'll let you wear these night goggles." She just shook her head. "Look what I have," he said, holding up his hand. She stared uncomprehendingly. It was probably too dark for her to see. "It's your ball, Lex. I found your ball." "So what?" He tried another approach. "Must be uncomfortable in there. Cold, too. Wouldn't you like to come out?" She resumed banging her head against the pipe. "Why not?" "There's aminals out there." That threw him for a moment. She hadn't said aminals for years. "The aminals are gone," he said. "There's a big one, a Tyrannosaurus Rex." "He's gone." "Where'd it go?" "I don't know, but he's not around here now," Tim said, hoping it was true. Lex didn't move. He heard her banging again. Tim sat down in the grass outside the pipe, where she could see him. The ground was wet where he sat. He hugged his knees and waited. He couldn't think of anything else to do. "I'm just gonna sit here," he said, "and rest." "Is Daddy out there?" "No," he said, feeling strange. "He's back at home, Lex." "Is Mommy?" "No, Lex." "Are there any grown-ups out there?" Lex said. "Not yet, but I'm sure they'll come soon. They're probably on their way right now." Then he heard her moving inside the pipe, and she came out, shivering with cold and with dried blood on her forehead, but otherwise all right. She looked around in surprise and said, "Where's Dr. Grant?" "I don't know." "Well, he was here before." "He was? When?" "Before," Lex said. "I saw him when I was in the pipe." "Where'd he go?" "How am I supposed to know?" Lex said, wrinkling her nose. She began to shout, "Hello! Hello! Dr. Grant! Dr. Grant!" Tim was uneasy at the noise she was making. It might bring back the Tyrannosaur, but a moment later he heard an answering shout. It was coming from the right, over toward the land cruiser that Tim had left a few minutes before. With his goggles, Tim saw with relief that Dr. Grant was walking toward them. He had a big tear in his shirt at the shoulder, but otherwise he looked okay. "Thank God," he said. "I've been looking for you." Shivering, Ed Regis got to his feet and wiped his cold mud off his face and hands. He had spent a very bad half hour wedged among big boulders on the slope of the hill below the road. He knew it wasn't much of a hiding place, but he was panicked and he wasn't thinking clearly. He had lain in this muddy, cold place and he had tried to get hold of himself, but he kept seeing that dinosaur in his mind. That dinosaur coming toward him, toward the car. Edward just didn't remember exactly what had happened after that. He remembered that Lex had said something but hadn't stopped. He couldn't stop. He just kept running and running. Beyond the road, he lost his footing and tumbled down the hill and come to the rest by some boulders. And it seemed to him that he could crawl in among the boulders and hide. There was enough room, so that was when he had done. Gasping and terrified, thinking of nothing except to get away from the Tyrannosaur. And finally, when he was wedged in there like a rat between the boulders, he had calmed down a little. And he overcome with horror and shame because he abandoned those kids. He had just run away, and he had just saved himself. He knew he should go back up the road. He should try to rescue them because he had always imagined himself as brave and cool under pressure, but whenever he tried to get control of himself to make himself go back there, somehow he just couldn't. He just started to feel panicky and trouble breathing, and he didn't move. He told himself it was hopeless anyway. If the kids were still up there on the road, they could never survive, and certainly there was nothing Ed Regis could do for them. And he might as well just stay where he was. No one was going to know what happened except him, and there was nothing he could do. Nothing he could have done. And so Regis had remained among the boulders for half an hour, fighting off panic carefully, not thinking about whether the kids died or about what Hammond would have said if he found out. What finally made him move was the peculiar sensation he noticed in his mouth. The side of his mouth felt funny, kind of numb and tingling, and he wondered if he heard it during the fall. Regis touched his face and felt swollen flesh on the side of his mouth. It was funny, but it didn't hurt at all. Then he realized the swollen flesh was a leech growing fat as it sucked his lip. It was practically in his mouth. Shivering with nausea, Regis pulled the leech away, feeling it tear from the flesh of his lips. Feeling the gush of warm blood in his mouth, he spat and flung it with disgust into the forest. He saw another leech on his forearm and pulled it off, leaving a dark bloody streak behind. Jesus, he was probably covered in them. That fall down the hillside, these jungle hills were just full of leeches. So were the dark rocky crevices. What did the workmen say? The leeches crawled up your underwear? They like the dark, warm places? They like to crawl right up your... Hello? He stopped. It was a voice carried by the wind. Hello? Dr. Grant? Jesus, that was the little girl. Ed Regis listened to the tone of her voice. She didn't sound frightened or in pain. She was just calling out in her insistent way, and it slowly dawned on him that something else might have happened. That the Tyrannosaur must have gotten away, or at least hadn't attacked. And on the other people might still be alive. Grant and Malcolm, everybody might be alive, and the realization made him pull himself together in an instant. The way you got sober in an instant when the cops pulled you over. And he felt better, because now he knew what he had to do. And he had crawled out from the boulders. He was already formulating the next step. Already figuring out what he would say, how to handle things from his point. Regis wiped the cold mud off his face and hands. The evidence that he had been hiding. He wasn't embarrassed that he had been hiding, but now he had to take charge. He scrambled back up toward the road. But when he emerged from the foliage, he had a moment of disorientation. He didn't see the cars at all. He was somehow at the bottom of the hill. The land cruisers must be at the top. He started walking up the hill back toward the land cruisers. It was very quiet. His feet splashed in the muddy puddles. He couldn't hear the little girl anymore. Why had she stopped calling? As he walked, he began to think that maybe something had happened to her. In that case, he shouldn't walk back there. Maybe the Tyrannosaur was still hanging around. Here he was, already at the bottom of the hill, that much closer to home. And it was so quiet. Spooky. It was so quiet. Ed Regis turned around and started walking back toward the camp. Alan Grant ran his hands over his limbs, squeezing the arms, legs briefly. She didn't seem to have any pain. It was amazing. Aside from the cut on her head, she was fine. I told you I was, she said. Well, I had to check. The boy was not quite fortunate. Tim's nose was swollen and painful. Grant suspected it was broken. His right shoulder was badly bruised and swollen, but his legs seemed to be all right. Both kids could walk. That was the important thing. Grant himself was all right except for a claw abrasion down the right chest, where the Tyrannosaur had kicked him. It burned with every breath, but it didn't seem to be serious. It didn't limit his movement. He wondered if he had been knocked unconscious because he had only dim recollections of the events immediately preceding the moment he had set up groaning in the woods 10 yards from the land cruiser. At first his chest had been bleeding, so he had struck leaves on the wound, and after a while it clotted. Then he had started walking around, looking for Malcolm and the kids. Grant couldn't believe he was still alive, and his scattered images began to come back to him. He tried to make sense of them. The Tyrannosaur should have killed them all easily. Why hadn't it? "I'm hungry," Lex said. "Me too," Grant said. "We've got to get ourselves back to civilization. We've got to tell them about the ship." "We're the only ones who know?" Tim said. "Yes, we've got to get back and tell them." "Let's walk down the road toward the hotel," Tim said, pointing down the hill. "That way we'll meet them and they'll come for us." Grant considered that, and he kept thinking about one thing: the dark shape that crossed between the land cruisers even before the attack started. What animal could that have been? He could think of only one possibility: the little Tyrannosaur. I don't think so, Tim. The road has high fences on both sides," Grant said. "If one of the Tyrannosaurs is farther down the road, we'd be trapped." "Then should we wait here?" Tim said. "Yes," Grant said. "Let's just wait here until someone comes." "I'm hungry," Lex said. "I hope it won't be very long," Grant said. "I don't want to stay here," Lex said. Then from the bottom of the hill, they heard the sound of a man coughing. "Stay here," Grant said. He ran forward to look down the hill. "Stay here," Grant said. He ran forward after him. Lex followed her brother. "Don't leave me! Don't leave me here, you guys!" Grant clapped his hand over her mouth. She struggled to protest. He shook his head and pointed over the hill for her to look. At the bottom of the hill, Grant saw Ed Regis, standing rigid, unmoving. The forest around them had become deadly silent. The steady background drone of cicadas and frogs had ceased abruptly. There was only the faint rustle of leaves and the whine of the wind. Lex started to speak, but Grant pulled her against the trunk of the nearest tree, ducking down among the heavy, gnarled roots at the base. Tim came in right after them. Grant put his hands to his lips, signaling them to be quiet, and then he suddenly looked around the tree. The road below was dark, and as the branches of the big trees moved in the wind, the moonlight filtering through made a dappled, shifting pattern. Ed Regis was gone. It took Grant a moment to locate him. The publicist was pressed up against the trunk of a big tree, hugging it. Regis wasn't moving at all. The forest remained silent. Lex tugged impatiently at Grant's shirt. She wanted to know what was happening. Then, from somewhere very near, they heard a soft, snorting exhalation, hardly louder than the wind. Lex heard it too, because she stopped struggling. The sound floated toward them again, soft as a sigh. Grant thought it was almost like the breathing of a horse. Grant looked at Regis and saw the moving shadows cast by the moonlight on the trunk of the tree, and then Grant realized there was another shadow, superimposed on the others but not moving, a strong curved neck and a square head. The exhalation came again. Tim leaned forward cautiously to look. Lex did too. They heard a crack as the branch broke, and into the path stepped the Tyrannosaur. It was the juvenile, about 8 feet tall, and it moved with the clumsy gait of a young animal, almost like a puppy. The juvenile Tyrannosaur shuffled down the path, stopped with every step to sniff the air before moving on. It passed the tree where Regis was hiding, and gave no indication that it had seen him. Grant saw Regis's body relax slightly. Regis turned his head, trying to watch the Tyrannosaur on the far side of the tree. The Tyrannosaur was now out of the view down the road. Regis started to relax, releasing his grip on the tree, but the jungle remained silent. Regis remained close to the tree trunk for another half a minute. Then the sounds of the forest returned. The first tentative croak of a tree frog, the buzz of one cicada, and then the full chorus. Regis stepped away from the tree, shaking his shoulders, releasing the tension. He walked into the middle of the road, looking in the direction of the departed Tyrannosaur. The attack came from the left. The juvenile roared as it swung its head forward, knocking Regis flat to the ground. He yelled and scrambled to his feet, but the Tyrannosaur pounced. and it must have pinned him with its hind leg because suddenly Regis wasn't moving. He was sitting up in the path, shouting at the dinosaur and waving his hands at it, as if he could scare it off. The young dinosaur seemed perplexed by the sounds and movement coming from its tiny prey. The juvenile bent its head over, sniffing curiously, and Regis pounded on the snout with his fists. "Get away! Back off! Go on, back off!" Regis was shouting at the top of his lungs, and the dinosaur backed away, allowing Regis to get to his feet. Regis was shouting, "Yeah! You heard me! Back off! Get away!" As he moved away from the dinosaur, the juvenile continued to stare curiously at the odd, noisy little animal before it. But when Regis had gone a few paces, it lunged and knocked him down again. "It's playing with him," Grant thought. "Hey!" Regis shouted as he fell, but the juvenile didn't pursue him, allowing him to get to his feet. He jumped to his feet and continued backing away. "You stupid! Back! Back! You hear me? Back!" He shouted like a lion tamer. The juvenile roared, but it did not attack, and Regis now edged toward the trees and high foliage to the right. In another few steps, he would be hiding. "Back, you! Back!" he shouted, and then, at the last moment, the juvenile pounced and knocked Regis flat on his back. "Cut that out!" Regis yelled, and the juvenile ducked his head, and Regis began to scream. No words, just a high-pitched scream. The scream cut off abruptly, and when the juvenile lifted its head, Grant saw ragged flesh in his jaws. "Oh, no," Lex said softly. Beside her, Tim had turned away, suddenly nauseated. His night vision goggles slipped from his forehead and landed on the ground with a metallic clink. The juvenile's head snapped up and looked toward the top of the hill. Tim picked up his goggles as Grant grabbed both the children's hands and began to run. Control. In the night, the compies scurried along the side of the road. Harding's jeep followed a short distance behind. Ellie pointed farther up the road. "Is that a light?" "Could be," Harding said. "Looks almost like headlights." The radio suddenly hummed and crackled. They heard John Arnold say, "You there?" "Ah, there he is," Harding said. "Finally." He pressed the button. "Yes, John, we're here. We're near the river, following the compies. It's quite interesting." More crackling. "Eat your car." "What'd he say?" Gennaro said. "Something about a car," Ellie said. At Grant's dig in Montana, Ellie was the one who operated the radiophone. After years of experience, she had become skilled at picking up garbled transmissions. "I think he said he needs your car." Harding pressed the button. "John, are you there? We can't read you very well. John." There was a flash of lightning, followed by a long sizzle of radio static. Then Arnold's tense voice. "Where are..." "We're on the mile north of the Hipsy paddock, near the river, following some compies." "No, damn, well, get back here, out." "Sounds like he's got a problem," Ellie said, frowning. There was no mistaking the tension in the voice. "Maybe we should go back." Harding shrugged. "John's frequently got a problem. You know how engineers are. They want everything to be by the book." He pressed a button on the radio. "John, say that again, please." More crackling. More static. The loud crash of lightning, then... "Muldoon needs your car out." Gennaro frowned. "Is he saying Muldoon needs our car?" "That's what it sounded like," Ellie said. "Well, that doesn't make any sense," Harding said. "Other stuck. Muldoon wants car." "I get it," Ellie said. "The other cars are stuck on the road in the storm, and Muldoon wants to go get them." Harding shrugged. "Why doesn't Muldoon take the other car?" He pushed the radio button. "John, tell Muldoon take the other car. It's in the garage." The radio crackled. "Not listen, crazy bastards. Car..." Harding pressed the radio button again. "I said it's in the garage, John. The car's in the garage." More static. "Edry has one." "I'm afraid this isn't getting us anywhere," Harding said. "All right, John, we're coming in now." He turned the radio off and turned the car around. "I just wish I understood what the urgency is." Harding put the jeep in gear, and they rumbled down the road in the darkness. It It was another 10 minutes before they saw the welcoming lights of the safari lodge, and as Harding pulled to a stop in the front of the visitor center, they saw Muldoon coming toward them. He was shouting and waving his arms. "God damn it, Arnold, you son of a bitch! God damn it, get this park back on track now! Get my grandkids back here now!" John Hammond stood in the control room, screaming and stamping his little feet. He had been carrying on this way for the last 2 minutes, while Henry Wu stood in the corner, looking stunned. "Well, Mr. Hammond," Arnold said, "Muldoon's on his way out right now to do exactly that." Arnold turned away and lit another cigarette. Hammond was like every other management guy Arnold had ever seen. Whether it was Disney or the Navy, management guys always behaved the same. They never understood the technical issues, and they thought that screaming was the way to make things happen. And maybe it was, if you're shouting at your secretaries to get you a limousine. But screaming didn't make any difference at all to the problems that Arnold now faced. The computer didn't care if it was screamed at. The power network didn't care if it was screamed at. Technical systems were completely indifferent to all of this explosive human emotion. If anything, screaming was counterproductive because Arnold now faced the virtual certainty that Nedry wasn't coming back, which meant that Arnold himself had to go into the computer code and try to figure out what had gone wrong. It was going to be a painstaking job. He'd need to be calm and careful. "Why don't you go downstairs to the cafeteria?" Arnold said. "Get a cup of coffee. We'll call you when we have more news." "I don't want a Malcolm effect here," Hammond said. "Don't worry about a Malcolm effect," Arnold said. "Will you let me get to work?" "God damn you," Hammond said. "I'll call you, sir, when I have news from Muldoon," Arnold said. He pushed buttons on his console and saw the familiar control screens change. Jurassic Park, main modules. Call libs, include biostat.sys, include sysrom.vst, include net.system, include power.module, initialize, set main, 42 2002 9A total course systop %4 vig 7 tty. If valid meter mh meter viz return. Terminal call 909 c.lev void meter viz 303 random 3 mech field system set. Arnold was no longer operating the computer. He had now gone behind the scenes to look at the code, the line-by-line instructions that told the computer how to behave. Arnold was unhappily aware that the complete Jurassic Park program contained more than 500,000 lines of code, most of it undocumented, without explanation. Wu came forward. "What are you doing, John?" "Checking the code." "By inspection? That'll take forever." "Tell me," Arnold said. "Tell me." The road. Muldoon took the curve very fast, the jeep sliding on the mud. Sitting beside him, Gennaro clenched his fists. They were racing along the cliff road, high above the river, now hidden below them in darkness. Muldoon accelerated forward. His face was tense. "How much farther?" Gennaro said. 2, maybe 3 miles. Ellie and Harding were back in the visitor center. Gennaro had offered to accompany Muldoon. The car swerved. "It's been an hour," Muldoon said. "An hour with no word from the other cars." "But they have radios," Gennaro said. "We haven't been able to raise them," Muldoon said. Gennaro frowned. "If I was sitting in a car for an hour in the rain, I'd sure try to use the radio to call for somebody." "So would I," Muldoon said. Gennaro shook his head. "You really think something could have happened to them?" "Chances are," Muldoon said, "that they're still perfectly fine, but I'll be happy when I finally see them. Should be any minute now." The road curved and then ran up a hill. At the base of the hill, Gennaro saw something white, lying among the ferns by the side of the road. "Hold it!" Gennaro said, and Muldoon braked. Gennaro jumped out and ran forward in the headlights of the jeep to see what it was. It looked like a piece of clothing, but there was... Gennaro stopped. Even from 6 feet away, he could clearly see what it was. He walked forward more slowly. Muldoon leaned out of the car and said, "What is it?" "It's a leg," Gennaro said. The flesh of the leg was pale blue-white, terminating in a ragged, bloody stump where the knee had been. Below the calf he saw a white sock and a brown slip-on shoe. was the kind of shoe Ed Regis had been wearing. By then, Muldoon was out of the car, running past him to crouch over the leg. Jesus! He lifted the leg out of the foliage, raising it into the light of the headlamps, and blood from the stump gushed down over his hand. Gennaro was still 3 feet away. He quickly bent over, put his hands on his knees, squeezed his eyes shut, and breathed deeply, trying not to be sick. "Gennaro!" Muldoon's voice was sharp. "What?" "Move, you're blocking the light." Gennaro took a breath and moved. When he opened his eyes, he saw Muldoon peering critically at the stump. "Torn at the joint line," Muldoon said. "Didn't bite it. Twisted and ripped it. Just ripped his leg off." Muldoon stood up, holding the severed leg upside down so the remaining blood dripped onto the ferns. His bloody hand smudged the white sock as he gripped the ankle. Gennaro felt sick again. "Another question what happened," Muldoon was saying. "T-Rex got him." Muldoon looked up at the hill, then back at Gennaro. "You alright? Can you go on?" Yeah," Gennaro said. "I can go on." Muldoon was walking back toward the jeep, carrying the leg. "I guess we better bring this along," he said. "Doesn't seem right to leave it here. Christ, it's gonna make a mess of the car. See if there's anything in the back, will you? A top or a newspaper?" Gennaro opened the back door and rummaged around in the space behind the rear seat. He felt grateful to think about something else for a moment. The problem of how to wrap a severed leg expanded to fill his mind, crowding out all the other thoughts. He found a canvas bag with a toolkit, a wheel rim, a cardboard box, and 2 tarps, he said. They were neatly folded plastic. "Give me one," Muldoon said, still standing outside the car. Muldoon wrapped the leg and passed the now shapeless bundle to Gennaro. Holding it in his hand, Gennaro was surprised at how heavy it felt. "Just put it in the back," Muldoon said. "If there's any way to wedge it, so it doesn't just roll around." "Okay," Gennaro put the bundle in the back, and Muldoon got behind the wheel. He accelerated, the wheel spinning in the mud, then digging in. The jeep rushed up the hill, and for a moment, at the top of the headlights still pointed upward toward the foliage, and then they swung down, and Gennaro could see the road before them. "Jesus," Muldoon said. Gennaro saw a single Land Cruiser, lying on its side in the center of the road. He couldn't see the second Land Cruiser at all. "Where's the other car?" Muldoon looked around briefly, pointing to the lift. "There." The second Land Cruiser was 20 feet away, crumpled at the foot of the tree. "What's it doing there?" "The T-Rex threw it." "Threw it?" Gennaro said. Muldoon's face was grim. "Let's get this over with," he said. Climbing out of the jeep, they hurried forward to the second Land Cruiser. Their flashlights swung back and forth in the night. As they came closer, Gennaro saw how battered the car was. He was careful to let Muldoon look inside first. "I wouldn't worry," Muldoon said. "It's very unlikely that we'll find anyone." "No?" "No," he said. He explained that during his years in Africa, he had visited the scenes of half a dozen animal attacks on humans in the bush. One leopard attack. The leopard had torn open the tent in the night and taken a 3-year-old child. Then one buffalo attack in Amboseli. 2 lion attacks, 1 croc attack in the north near Meru. In every case, there was a surprisingly little evidence left behind. Inexperienced people imagined horrific proofs of an animal attack, torn limbs left behind at the tent, trails of dripping blood leading away to the bush, blood-stained clothing not far from the campsite. But the truth was, there was usually nothing at all, particularly if the victim was small, an infant, or young child. The person just seemed to disappear, as if he walked out of the bush and never come back. A predator could kill a child just by shaking it, snapping the neck. Usually, there wasn't any blood, and most of the time you never found any of the remains of the victims. Sometimes a button from a shirt, or a sliver of rubber from a shoe, but most of the time, nothing. Predators took children. They preferred children, and they left nothing behind. So Muldoon thought it was highly unlikely that they would ever find any remains of the children. But as he looked in now, he had a surprise. "I'll be damned," he said. Muldoon tried to put the scene together. The front windshield of the Land Cruiser was shattered, but there wasn't much glass nearby. He had noticed shards of glass back on the road, so the windshield must have broken back there, before the Tyrannosaur picked the car up and threw it there. But the car had taken a tremendous beating. Muldoon shone his light inside. "Empty?" Gennaro said tensely. "Not quite," Muldoon said. His flashlight glinted off a crushed radio handset, and on the floor of the car he saw something else. Something curved and black. The front doors were dented and jammed shut, but he climbed in through the back door and crawled over the seat to pick up the black object. "It's a watch," he said, peering in as of the beam of the flashlight. A cheap digital watch with a molded black rubber strap. The LCD face was shattered. He thought the boy might have been wearing it, though he wasn't sure. But it was the kind of watch a kid would have. "What is it, a watch?" Gennaro said. "Yes, and there's the radio, but it's broken." "Is that significant?" "Yes, and there's something else," Muldoon sniffed. There was a sour odor inside the car. He shone the light around until he saw the vomit dripping off the side door panel. He touched it, still fresh. "One of the kids might still be alive," Muldoon said. Gennaro squinted at him. "What makes you think so?" "The watch," Muldoon said. "The watch proves it." He handed the watch to Gennaro, who held it in the glow of the flashlight and turned it over in his hands. "Crystal's cracked," Gennaro said. "That's right," Muldoon said. "And the band is uninjured." "Which means?" "The kid took it off." "That could have happened at any time," Gennaro said. "Any time before the attack." "No," Muldoon said. "Those LCD crystals are tough. It takes a powerful blow to break them. The watch face is shattered during the attack." "So the kid took his watch off?" "Think about it," Muldoon said. "If you were being attacked by a Tyrannosaur, would you stop to take your watch off?" "Maybe it was torn off." "It's almost impossible to tear your watch off somebody's wrist without tearing the hand off too. Anyway, the band is intact." "No," Muldoon said. "The kid took it off himself. He looked at his watch, saw it was broken, and took it off. He had the time to do that." "When?" "Could have been after the attack," Muldoon said. "The kid must have been in this car after the attack and the radio was broken, so he left it behind too. He's a bright kid and he knew they weren't useful." "If he's so bright," Gennaro said, "where'd he go? Because I'd stay right here and wait for it to be picked up." "Yes," Muldoon said, "but perhaps he couldn't stay here. Maybe the Tyrannosaur came back, or some other animal. Anyway, something made him leave." "Then where'd he go?" Gennaro said. "Let's see if we can determine that," Muldoon said, as he strode off toward the main road. Gennaro watched Muldoon peering at the ground with his flashlight. His face was just inches from the mud, intent on his search. Muldoon really believed he was onto something, that at least one of the kids was still alive. Gennaro remained unimpressed. The shock of finding the severed leg had left him with grim determination to close the park and destroy it. No matter what Muldoon said, Gennaro suspected him of unwarranted enthusiasm and hopefulness, and... "You notice these prints?" Muldoon asked, still looking at the ground. "What prints?" Gennaro said. "These footprints, see them? Coming toward us from the road? They're adult-sized prints. Some kind of rubber sole shoe. Notice the distinctive tread pattern." Gennaro saw only mud. Puddles catching the light from the flashlights. "You can see," Muldoon continued, "the adult prints come to here, where they're joined at the other prints. Small and medium-sized, moving around in circles. Overlapping, almost as if they're standing together, walking. But now they're here, and they seem to be running," he pointed off. "There, into the park." Gennaro shook his head. "You can see whatever you want in this mud." Muldoon got to his feet and stepped back. He looked down at the ground inside. "Say what you like. I'll wager one of the kids survived, and maybe both. Perhaps even adult as well. If these big prints belong to someone other than Regis, we've got to search the park." "Tonight?" Gennaro said. But Muldoon wasn't listening. He had walked away toward the embankment of the soft earth, near a drain pipe for rain. He crouched again. "What was that little girl wearing?" "Christ!" Gennaro said. I don't know." Proceeding slowly, Muldoon moved farther toward the side of the road, and then he heard a wheezing sound. It was definitely an animal sound. "Listen!" Gennaro said, feeling panic. "I think we better—" "Shh!" Muldoon said. He paused, listening. "It's just the wind," Gennaro said. They heard the wheezing again. distinctly this time. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the foliage directly ahead of him, by the side of the road. It didn't sound like an animal, but Muldoon moved forward cautiously. He waggled his light and shouted, but the wheezing did not change character. Muldoon pushed aside the fronds of the palm. "What is it?" Gennaro said. "It's Malcolm," Muldoon said. Ian Malcolm lay on his back, his skin gray-white, mouth slacked open. His breath came in wheezing gasps. Muldoon handed the flashlight to Gennaro and then bent to examine the body. "I can't find the injury," he said. "Head okay? Chest? Arms?" Then Gennaro shone the light on his legs. He put a tourniquet on. Malcolm's belt was twisted tight over the right thigh. Gennaro moved the light down toward the leg. The right ankle was bent outward at the awkward angle from the leg. The trousers flattened, soaked in blood. Muldoon touched the ankle gently, and Malcolm groaned. Muldoon stepped back and tried to decide what to do next. Malcolm might have other injuries. His back might be broken. It might kill and move him, but if they left him here, he would die of shock. It was only because he had the presence of mind to put a tourniquet on that he hadn't really bled to death, and probably he was doomed. They might as well move him. Gennaro helped Muldoon pick the man up, hoisting him awkwardly over their shoulders. Malcolm moaned and breathed in ragged gasps. "Lex," he said. "Lex went... Lex..." "Who's Lex?" Muldoon said. "The little girl," Gennaro said. They carried Malcolm back to the jeep and wrestled him into the back seat. Gennaro tightened the tourniquet around his leg. Malcolm groaned again. Muldoon slid the trouser cuff up and saw the pulpy flesh beneath, the dull white splinters of protruding bone. "We've got to get him back," Muldoon said. "You're going to leave here without the kids?" Gennaro said. "If they went to the park, it's 20 square miles, Muldoon said, shaking his head. "The only way we can find anything out there is if we have motion sensors. If the kids are alive and moving around, the motion sensors will pick them up, and we can go right to them and bring them back. But if we don't take Dr. Malcolm back right now, he'll die." "Then we have to go back," Gennaro said. "Yes, I think so." They climbed into the car. Gennaro said, "Are you going to tell Hammond the kids are missing?" "No," Muldoon said. "You are." Control. Donald Gennaro stared at Hammond, sitting in the deserted cafeteria. The man was spooning ice cream, calmly eating it. "So, Muldoon believes the children are somewhere in the park?" "He thinks so, yes." "Then I'm sure we'll find them." "I hope so," Gennaro said. He watched the old man deliberately eating, and he felt a chill. "Oh, I'm sure we'll find them. After all, I keep telling everyone the park is made for kids," Gennaro said. "Just so you understand that they're missing, sir." "Missing?" he snapped. "Of course I know they're missing. I'm not senile." He sighed and changed tone again. "Look, Donald," Hammond said, "let's not get carried away. We've had a little breakdown from the storm or whatever, and as a result we've suffered a regrettable, unfortunate accident, and that's all that's happened. We're dealing with it. Arnold will get the computers cleaned up. Muldoon will pick up the kids, and I have no doubt he'll be back with them by the time we finish this ice cream. So let's just wait and see what develops, shall we?" "Whatever you say, sir," Gennaro said. "Hey," Henry said, looking at the console screen. "'Cause I think Nedry did something to the code," Arnold said. "That's why I'm checking it." "All right," Wu said, "but have you tried your options?" "Like what?" Arnold said. "I don't know. Aren't the safety systems still running?" Wu said. "Key checks, all that." "Jesus," Arnold said, snapping his fingers. "They must be. Safety systems can't be turned off except at the main panel." "Well," Wu said, "if key checks is active, you can trace what he did." "I sure as hell can," Arnold said. He started to press buttons. Why hadn't we thought of it before? It was so obvious. The computer systems at Jurassic Park had several tiers of safety systems built into it. One of them was a key check program, which monitored all the keystrokes entered by operators with access to the system. It was originally installed as a debugging device, but it was retained for its security value. In a moment, all of the keystrokes that Nedry had entered to the computer earlier in the day were listed in a window on the screen. System, Nedry. Go to command level, Nedry. Mr. Goodbytes, security, key check off, safety off. "That's it," Arnold said. He was screwing around here for hours, it seemed like. Probably just killing time, Wu said, until he finally decided to get down to it. The initial list of numbers represented the ASC2 keyboard codes for the keys Nedry had pushed at his console. Those numbers meant he was still within the standard user interface, like any ordinary user of the computer. So, initially, Nedry was just looking around, which you wouldn't have expected of the programmer who had designed the systems. Maybe he was trying to see if there were changes before he went in, Wu said. Maybe, Arnold said. Arnold was now looking at the list of commands, which allowed him to follow Nedry's progression through the system, line by line. At least we could see what he did. System was Nedry's request to leave the ordinary user interface and access the code itself. The computer asked for his name, and they replied, Nedry. The name was authorized to access the code, so the computer allowed him into the system. Nedry asked to go to command level, the computer's highest level of control. The command level required extra security and asked Nedry for his name, access number, and password. Nedry 040XY67 at Mr. Goodbytes. Those entries got Nedry into the command level. From there, he wanted security, and since he was authorized, the computer allowed him to go there. Once at the security level, Nedry tried 3 variations. Key check off, safety off, SL off. He's trying to turn off the safety systems, Wu said. He doesn't want anybody want to see what he's about to do. Exactly, Arnold said. And apparently he doesn't know if it's longer possible to turn the systems off except by manually flipping the switches at the main board. After 3 failed commands, the computer automatically began to worry about Nedry. But since he had gotten into proper authorization, the computer would assume that Nedry was lost, trying to do something he couldn't accomplish from where he was. So the computer asked him again where he wanted to be, and Nedry said, security, and he was allowed to remain there. Finally, Wu said, here's the kicker. He pointed to the last of the commands Nedry had entered. White_rabbit.object. What the hell is that? Arnold said. White rabbit? Is that supposed to be his private joke? It's marked as an object, Wu said. In computer terminology, an object was a block of code that could be moved around and used. The way you might move a chair in a room. An object might be a set of commands to draw a picture, or to refresh the screen, or to perform a certain calculation. Let's see where it is in the code, Arnold said. Maybe we can figure out what it does. He went to the program utilities and typed find white_rabbit.object. The computer flashed back. Object not found in libraries. Doesn't exist, Arnold said. Then search the code listing, Wu said. Arnold typed find/listings white_rabbit.object. The screen scrolled rapidly, the lines of code blurring as they swept past. It continued this way for almost a minute, and then the screen showed the arrow pointing to a single line of code. Son of a bitch, Arnold said. Wu shook his head. It isn't a bug in the code at all. No, Arnold said. It's a trap door. The fat bastard put it in and looked like an object call, but it's actually a command that links to security and perimeter systems, and then turns them off. Gives them complete access to every place in the park. Then we must be able to turn them back on, Wu said. Yeah, we must. Arnold frowned at the screen. All you got to do is figure out the command, and I'll run the execution trace to the link, he said. We'll see where that gets us. Wu got up from his chair. Meanwhile, that somebody went to the freezer about an hour ago. Think I better count my embryos. Ellie was in her room, about to change out of her wet clothes, when there was a knock at the door. Alan? She said, but when she opened the door, she saw Muldoon standing there, with a plastic-wrapped package under his arm. Muldoon was also soaking wet, and there were streaks of dirt on his clothes. I'm sorry, but we need your help, Muldoon said briskly. The land cruisers were attacked an hour ago. We brought Malcolm back, but he's in shock. He's got a very bad injury on his leg. He's still unconscious, but I put him into bed in his room. Harding's on his way over. Harding? She said. What about the others? We haven't found the others yet, Dr. Sattler, Muldoon said. He was speaking slowly now. Oh my god. But we think that Dr. Grant and the children were still alive. We think that they went into the park, Dr. Sattler. Went to the park? We think so. Meanwhile, Malcolm needs your help. I've got Harding. Shouldn't you call the doctor? There's no doctor on the island. Harding's the best we have. Surely you can call for a doctor, she said. No, Muldoon shook his head. Phone lines are down. We can't call out. He shifted the package in his arm. What's that? She said. Nothing. Just go to Malcolm's room and help Harding if you will. And Muldoon was gone. She sat on her bed, shocked. Ellie Sattler was not a woman disposed to unnecessary panic, and she had known Grant to get out of dangerous situations before. Once he had been lost in the Badlands for 4 days where a cliff gave way beneath him and his truck fell 100 feet into a ravine. Grant's right leg was broken. He had no water, but he walked back on a broken leg. On the other hand, the kids... She shook her head, pushing the thought away. The kids were probably with Grant, and if Grant was out of the park, well, what better person to get them safely through Jurassic Park than a dinosaur expert? In the park. I'm tired, Lex said. Carry me, Dr. Grant? You're too big to carry, Tim said. But I'm tired, she said. Okay, Lex, Grant said, picking her up. Oof, you're heavy. It was almost 9 p.m. The full moon was blurred by drifting mist, and their blunted shadows led them across an open field, toward the dark woods beyond. Grant was lost in thought, trying to decide where he was. Since they had originally crossed over the fence that the Tyrannosaur had battered down, Grant was reasonably sure that they were now somewhere in the Tyrannosaur paddock, which was a place he did not want to be. In his mind, he kept seeing the computer tracing of the Tyrannosaur's home range, the tight squiggle of lines that traced his movements within a small area. He and the kids were in that area now. But Grant also remembered that the Tyrannosaurs were isolated from all the other animals, which meant that they would know that they had left the paddock when they crossed a barrier, a fence, or a moat, or both. He had seen no barrier so far. The girl put her head on his shoulders and twirled her hair in her fingers. Soon, she was snoring. Tim trudged alongside Grant. How you holding up, Tim? Okay, he said, but I think we might be in the Tyrannosaur area. I'm pretty sure we are. I hope we get out soon. You gonna go into the woods? Tim said. As they came closer, the woods seemed dark and forbidding. Yeah, Grant said. I think we can navigate by the numbers on the motion sensors. The motion sensors were green boxes set about 4 feet off the ground. Some were freestanding, most were attached to trees. None of them were working because apparently the power was still off. Each sensor box had a glass lens mounted in the center, and a painted code number beneath that. Up ahead, in the mist-streaked moonlight, Grant could see a box marked TS-04. They entered the forest. Huge trees loomed on all sides. In the moonlight, a low mist clung to the ground, curling around the roots of the trees. It was beautiful, but it made walking treacherous, and Grant was watching the sensors. They seemed to be numbered in descending order. He passed TS-03 and TS-04. Eventually they reached TS-01. He was tired from carrying the girl, and he had hoped that this would coincide with the boundary of the Tyrannosaur paddock, but it was just another box in the middle of the woods. The next box after that was TN1, followed by TN2. Grant realized the numbers must be arranged geographically around the central point, like a compass. They were going from south to north, so the numbers got smaller as they approached the center. Then they got larger again. At least we're going the right way, Tim said. Good for you, Grant said. Tim smiled and stumbled over vines in the mist. He got quickly to his feet. They walked on for a while. My parents are getting a divorce, he said. Uh-huh, Grant said. My dad moved out last month. He has his own place in Mill Valley now. Uh-huh. He never carries my sister anymore. Never even picks her up. And he says you have dinosaurs on the brain, Grant said. Tim sighed. Yeah. You miss him? Grant said. Not really, Tim said. Sometimes She misses him more. Who, your mother? No, Lex. My mom has a boyfriend. She knows him from work. They walked in silence for a while, passing TN03 and TN04. Have you met him? Grant said. Yeah. How is he? He's okay, Tim said. He's younger than my dad, but he's bald. How does he treat you? I don't know. Okay. I think he just tries to get on my good side. I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes my mom says we'll just have to sell the house and move. Sometimes he and my mom fight late at night. I sit in my room and play with my computer, but I can still hear it. Grant said. Are you divorced? No, Grant said. My wife died a long time ago. And now you're with Dr. Sattler? Grant smiled in the darkness. No, she's my student. You mean she's still in school? Graduate school, yes. Grant paused long enough to shift Lex to his other shoulder, and they continued on, past TN05 and TN06. There was a rumble of thunder in the distance. The storm had moved to the south. There was very little sound in the forest, except for the drone of cicadas and the soft croaking of tree frogs. You have children? Tim asked. No, Grant said. Are you going to marry Dr. Sattler? No. She's marrying a nice doctor in Chicago sometime next year. Oh, Tim said. He seemed surprised to hear it. They walked along for a while. Then, who are you going to marry? I don't think I'm going to marry anybody, Grant said. Me neither, Tim said. They walked for a while. Tim said, Are we going to walk all night? I don't think I can, Grant said. We'll have to stop at least a few hours. He glanced at his watch. We're okay. We've got almost 15 hours before we have to be back, before the ship reaches the mainland. Where are we going to stop? Tim asked immediately. Grant was wondering the same thing. His first thought was that they might climb a tree and sleep up there. But they would have to climb very high to get safely away from the animals, and Lex might fall out while she was asleep. And tree branches were hard. They wouldn't get any rest. At least, he wouldn't. They needed someplace really safe. He thought back to the plans he had seen on the jet coming down. He remembered that there were outlying buildings for each of the different divisions. Grant didn't know what they were like, because plans for the individual buildings weren't included, and he couldn't remember exactly where they were. But he remembered that they scattered all over the park. There might be buildings somewhere nearby. But that was a different requirement from simply crossing a barrier and getting out of the Tyrannosaur paddock. Finding a building meant a search strategy of some kind, and the best strategies were... Tim, can you hold your sister for me? I'm going to climb a tree and have a look around. High in the branches, he had a good view of the forest, the tops of the trees extending away to his left and right. They were surprisingly near the edge of the forest directly ahead of the trees ended before a clearing, with an electrified fence and a pale concrete moat. Beyond that, a large open field in what he assumed was the sauropod paddock. In the distance, more trees and misty moonlight sparkling on the ocean. Somewhere, he heard the bellowing of a dinosaur, but it was far away. He put on Tim's night vision goggles and looked again. He followed the gray curve of the moat and then saw what he was looking for, the dark strip of a service road leading to the flat rectangle of a roof. The roof was barely above ground level, but it was there, and it wasn't far, maybe a quarter of a mile or so from the tree. When he came down, Lex was sniffling. What's the matter? I heard an aminal. It won't bother us. Are you awake now? Come on. He led her to the fence. It was 12 feet high with a spiral of barbed wire at the top. It seemed to stretch far above them in the moonlight. The moat was immediately on the other side. Lex looked up at the fence doubtfully. Can you climb it? Grant asked her. She handed him her glove and her baseball. Sure, easy. She started to climb. But I bet Timmy can't. Tim spun in fury. You shut up. Timmy's afraid of heights. I'm not. She climbed higher. Are so. Am not. Then come and get me. Grant turned to Tim, pale in the darkness. The boy wasn't moving. You okay with the fence, Tim? Sure. Want some help? Timmy's a fraidy cat, Lex called. What a stupid jerk, Tim said as he started to climb. It's freezing, Lex said. They were standing waist deep in a smelly water at the bottom of the deep concrete moat. They had climbed to the fence without incident, except that Tim had torn his shirt on the coils of the barbed wire at the top. Then they had all slid down onto the moat, and now Grant was looking for a way out. At least I got Timmy over the fence for you, Lex said. He really is scared most times. Thanks for your help, Tim said sarcastically. In the moonlight, he could see floating lumps on the surface. He moved along the moat, looking at the concrete wall on the far side. The concrete was smooth. They couldn't possibly climb it. Ew, Lex said, pointing to the water. It won't hurt you, Lex. Grant finally found a place where the concrete had cracked and a vine grew down toward the water. He tugged on the vine, and it held its weight. Let's go, kids. They started to climb the vine back to the field above. It only took a few minutes to cross the field to the embankment leading to the below-grade service road and the maintenance building off to the right. They passed 2 motion sensors, and Grant noticed with some uneasiness that the sensors were still not working, nor were the lights. More than 2 hours had passed since the power first went out, and it was not yet restored. Somewhere in the distance, they heard the Tyrannosaur roar. Is he around here? Lex said. No, Grant said. We're in another section of the park from him. They slid down a grassy embankment and moved toward the concrete building in the darkness. It was forbidding, bunker-like. What is this place? Lex said. It's safe, Grant said, hoping it was true. The entrance gate was large enough to drive a truck through. It was fitted with heavy bars. Inside, they could see the building was an open shed, with piles of grass and bales of hay stacked among equipment. The gate was locked with heavy padlock. As Grant was examining it, Lex slipped sideways between the bars. Come on, you guys! Tim followed her. I think you could do it, Dr. Grant. He was right. It was a tight squeeze, but Grant was able to ease his body between the bars and get into the shed. As soon as he was inside, a wave of exhaustion struck him. I wonder if there's anything to eat, Lex said. Just hay. Grant broke open a bale and spread it around the concrete. The hay in the center was warm. They lay down, feeling the warmth. Lex curled up beside him and closed her eyes. Tim put his arm around her. He heard the sauropods trumpeting softly in the distance. Neither child spoke. They were almost immediately snoring. Grant raised his arm to look at his watch, but it was too dark to see. He felt the warmth of the children against his own body. Grant closed his eyes and slept. Control. Muldoon and Gennaro came into the control room just as Arnold clapped his hands and said, Got you, little son of a bitch. What is it? Gennaro said. Arnold pointed to the screen. That's it? That's it, Arnold said, pleased. That's what? Gennaro asked, staring at the screen. Finally found the command to restore the original code. The command called fini.object resets the linked parameters, namely the fence and power. Good, Muldoon said. But it does something else, Arnold said. Then erases the code lines that refer to it. It destroys all evidence it was ever there. Pretty slick. Gennaro shook his head. I don't know much about computers. Although he knew enough to know what it meant when high-tech company went back to the source code. It meant big, big problems. Well, watch this, Arnold said, as he typed in the command, fini.object. The screen flickered and immediately changed. Muldoon pointed to the windows. Look. Outside, the big quartz lights were coming on through the park. They went to the windows and looked out. Hot damn, Arnold said. Gennaro said, Does this mean the electrified fences are back on? You bet it does, Arnold said. It'll take a few seconds to get up to full power because we've got 50 miles of fence out there, and the generator has to charge the capacitors along the way. But in half a minute, we'll be back in business. Arnold pointed to the vertical glass see-through map of the park. On the map, Bright red lines were snaking out from the power station, moving through the park as electricity surged through the fences. "And the motion sensors?" Gennaro said. "Yes, them too. It'll be a few minutes while the computer counts. But everything's working," Arnold said. 9:30 and we've got the whole damn thing back up and running." Grant opened his eyes. Brilliant blue light was streaming into the building through the bars of the gate. Quartz light. The power was back on. Groggily, he looked at his watch. It was just 9:30. He'd been asleep only a couple of minutes. He decided he could sleep a few minutes more, and then he would go back to the field. He would stand in front of the motion sensors and wave, setting them off. The control room would spot him. They'd send a car out to pick him and the kids up. He'd tell Arnold to recall the supply ship, and they'd all finish the night in their just-owned beds back in the lodge. He would do that right away, in just a couple of minutes. He yawned and closed his eyes again. "Not bad," Arnold said in the control room, staring at the glowing map. "There's only 3 cutouts in the whole park. Much better than I hoped for." "Cutouts?" Gennaro said. "The fence automatically cuts out short-circuited sections," he explained. "You can see a big one here, in Sector 12, near the main road." "That's where the wrecks knocked the fence down," Muldoon said. "Exactly, and another one in there in Sector 11, near the sauropod maintenance building." "Why would that section be out?" Gennaro said. "God knows," Arnold said. "Probably storm damage or a fallen tree. We can check it out on the monitor in a while. The third one is over there by the Jungle River. Don't know why that'd be out either." As Gennaro looked, the map became more complex, filling the green spots and numbers. "What's all this?" "The animals. The motion sensors are working again, and the computer's starting to identify the location of all the animals in the park, and anybody else too." Gennaro stared at the map. "You mean Grant and the kids?" "Yeah. We've reset our search number above 400, so if they're out there moving around," Arnold said, "the motion sensors will pick them up as additional animals." He stared at the map. "But I don't see any additionals yet." "Why does it take so long?" Gennaro said. "You have to realize, Mr. Gennaro," Arnold said, "there's a lot of extraneous movement out there. Branches blowing in the wind, birds flying around, all kinds of stuff. The computer has to eliminate all the background movement. It may take, okay, count's finished." Gennaro said, "You don't see the kids?" Arnold twisted in his chair and looked back to the map. "No," he said. "At the moment, there are no additional animals on the map at all. Everything out there has been accounted for as dinosaur. They're probably up in the tree, or somewhere else we couldn't see them. I wouldn't worry yet. Several animals haven't shown up like the big wrecks. That's probably because they're sleeping somewhere and not moving. The people may be sleeping too. We just don't know." "We better get on with it," he said. "We need to repair the fences and get the animals back into the paddocks. According to that computer, we've got 5 dead back in the proper paddocks. I'll take the maintenance crews out now." Arnold turned to Gennaro. "You may want to see how Dr. Malcolm is doing. Tell Dr. Harding that Muldoon will need him in about an hour to supervise the herding, and I'll notify Mr. Hammond that we're starting to final cleanup." Gennaro passed through the iron gates and went to the front door of the safari lodge. He saw Ellie Sattler coming down the hallway, carrying towels and a pan of steaming water. "There's a kitchen at the other end," she said. "We're using that to boil the water for the dressings." "How is he?" Gennaro asked. "Surprisingly good," she said. Gennaro followed Ellie down the Malcolm's room, and was startled to hear the sound of laughter. The mathematician lay on his back in the bed, with Harding adjusting the IV line.
"So the other man says, I'll tell you frankly, I didn't like it, Bill. I went back to toilet paper."
Harding was laughing.
"It's not bad, is it?" Malcolm said, smiling. "Ah, Mr. Gennaro, you've come to see me. Now you know what happens from trying to get leg up on the situation."
Gennaro came in tentatively.
Harding said, "He's on a fairly high dose of morphine." "Not high enough, I can tell you," Malcolm said. "Christ, he's stingy with his drugs. Did they find the others yet?"
"No, not yet," Gennaro said. "But I'm glad to see you doing so well."
"How else should I be doing?" Malcolm said. "Well, a compound fracture of the leg that is likely septic and beginning to smell rather, pungent. What do I always say, if you can't keep a sense of humor?"
Gennaro smiled.
Do you remember what happened? Of course I remember, Malcolm said. Do you think you could be bitten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex and it would escape your mind? No, indeed. I'll tell you, you'll remember it for the rest of your life. In my case, probably not a terribly long time, but still, yes, I remember.
Malcolm described running from the land cruiser in the rain, being chased down by the Rex.
It's my own damn fault. He was too close, but I was panicked. In any case, he picked me up with his jaws.
How? Gennaro said.
Torso,
Malcolm said and lifted his shirt. A broad semicircle of bruised punctures ran from his shoulders to his navel.
Lifted me up in his jaws, shook me bloody hard, and threw me down. And I was fine, terrified of course, but still, in all, fine right up to the moment he threw me. I broke the leg in the fall, but the bite was not half bad, he sighed, considering.
Harding said, most of the big carnivores don't have strong jaws. The real power's in the neck's musculature. The jaws could hold on while they could use their neck to twist and rip. But with a small creature like Dr. Malcolm would just shake him and then toss him.
I'm afraid that's right, Malcolm said. I doubt I have survived, except the big chap's heart wasn't in it. To tell the truth, he struck me as a rather clumsy attacker, or anything less than an automobile or a small apartment building.
You think he attacked half-heartedly?
It pains me to say it, Malcolm said, but I don't honestly feel I had his full attention. He had mine, of course, but... and he weighed 8 tons. I don't.
Gennaro turned to Harding and said, they're going to repair the fences now. Arnold says Muldoon will need your help herding animals.
Okay, Harding said. So long as you leave me Dr. Sattler and ample morphine, Malcolm said. And so long as we don't have Malcolm effect here.
What's a Malcolm effect? Gennaro said.
Modesty forbids me, Malcolm said, from telling you the details of a phenomenon named after me.
He sighed again and closed his eyes. In a moment, he was sleeping. Ellie walked out into the hallway with Gennaro. Don't be fooled, she said. It's a great strain on him. When will you have the helicopter here? A helicopter? He needs surgery on that leg. Make sure they send for a helicopter to get him off this island. The park. The portable generator sputtered and roared to life, and the quartz floodlights glowed at the ends of the telescoping arms. Muldoon heard the soft gurgle of the jungle river a few yards to the north. He turned back to the maintenance van and saw one of the workmen coming out with a big power saw. No, he said. Just the ropes, Carlos. We don't need to cut it. He turned back to look at the fence. They had difficulty finding the shorted section at first, because there wasn't much to see. A small protocarpus tree was leaning against the fence. It was one of several that had been planted in this region of the park. Their feathery branches intended to conceal the fence from view. But this particular tree had been tied down with guy wires and turnbuckles. The wires had broken free in the storm, and the metal turnbuckles had blown against the fence and shorted it out. Of course, none of this should have happened. Ground crews were supposed to use plastic-coated wires and ceramic turnbuckles near fences. But it happened anyway. In any case, it wasn't going to be a big job. All they had to do was pull the tree off the fence, remove the metal fittings, and mark it for the gardeners to fix in the morning. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes, and that was just as well, because Muldoon knew that Dilophosaurs always stayed close to the river. Even though the workmen were separated from the river by a fence, the Dilos could still spit right through it, delivering their blinding poison. Ramon, one of the workmen, came over. Senor Muldoon, he said, did you see the lights? What lights? Muldoon said. Ramon pointed to the east. Through the jungle. I saw it as we were coming out. It is there, very faint. You see it? It looks like the lights of the car, but it's not moving. Muldoon squinted. It probably was just a maintenance light. After all, power was back on. We'll worry about it later, he said. Right now we gotta get that tree off the fence. Arnold was in an expansive mood. The park was almost back in order. Muldoon was repairing the fences. Hammond had gone off to supervise the transfer of the animals with Harding. Although he was tired, Arnold was feeling good. He was even in the mood to indulge the lawyer, Gennaro. The Malcolm effect? Arnold said. You worried about that? I'm just curious, Gennaro said. You mean you want me to tell you why Ian Malcolm is wrong? Sure. Arnold lit another cigarette. It's technical. Try me. Okay, Arnold said. Chaos theory describes nonlinear systems. It's now become a very broad theory that has been used to study everything from stock markets to heart rhythms. Very fashionable theory. Very trendy to apply to any complex system where there might be unpredictability. Okay, Gennaro said. Ian Malcolm is a mathematician specializing in chaos theory. Quite amusing and personable, but basically, what he does, besides wear black, is just use computers to model the behavior of complex systems. John Hyman loves the latest scientific fad, so he asked Malcolm to model the system at Jurassic Park. Which Malcolm did. Malcolm's models are all face-based shapes on a computer screen. Have you seen them? No? Gennaro said. Well, they look like a weird, twisted ship's propeller. According to Malcolm, the behavior of the system follows the surface of the propeller. You with me? Not exactly, Gennaro said. Arnold hit his hand in the air. Let's say I put a drop of water on the back of my hand. That drop is going to run off my hand. Maybe it'll run toward my wrist, maybe it'll run toward my thumb, or down between my fingers. I don't know for sure where it'll go, but I know it'll run somewhere along the surface of my hand. It has to. Okay, Gennaro said. Chaos theory treats this behavior of a whole system like a drop of water moving under a complicated propeller surface. The drop may spiral down or slip outward toward the edge. It may do many different things, depending. It will always move along the surface of the propeller. Okay. Malcolm's models tend to have a ledge, or a sharp incline, where the drop of water will speed up greatly. He modestly calls the speeding up movement the Malcolm effect. The whole system could suddenly collapse, and that was what he said about Jurassic Park. That it had inherent instability. Inherent instability? Gennaro said. What did you do when you got his report? We disagreed with it, and ignored it, of course, Arnold said. Was that wise? Self-evident, Arnold said. We're dealing with living systems, after all. This is life, not computer models. In the harsh quartz lights, the hip sylphidont's green head hung down out of the sling, the tongue dangling, the eyes dull. Careful, careful! Hammond shouted as the crane began to lift. Harding grunted and eased the head back onto the leather straps. He didn't want to impede circulation through the carotid artery. The crane hissed as it lifted the animal into the air, onto the waiting flatbed truck. The Hipsy was a small dryosaur, 7 feet long, weighing about 500 pounds. She was dark green with mottled brown spots. She was breathing slowly, but she seemed all right. Harding had shot her with a few moments before with the tranquilizer gun, and apparently he had guessed the correct dose. There was always a tense moment dosing these big animals. Too little and they would run off into the forest, collapsing where you couldn't get to them. Too much and they went into terminal cardiac arrest. This one had taken a single bounding leap and keeled over. Perfectly dosed. Watch it! Easy! Hammond was shouting over the workmen. Mr. Hammond, Harding said, please. Well, they should be careful. They are being careful, Harding said. He climbed onto the back of the flatbed as the Hipsy came down, and he set her into the restraining harness. Harding slipped on the cardiogram collar that monitored her heartbeat, then picked up the big electronic thermometer the size of a turkey baster, and slipped it into the rectum. It beeped. 96.2 degrees. How is she? Hammond asked fretfully. She's fine, Harding said. She's only dropped 1.5 degrees. That's too much, Hammond said. Too deep. You don't want her waking up and jumping off the truck, Harding snapped. Before coming to the park, Harding had been the chief of veterinary medicine at the San Diego Zoo, and the world's leading expert on avian care. He flew all over the world, consulting with zoos in Europe, India, and Japan on the care of exotic birds. He'd had no interest when this particular little man showed up, offering him a position in a private game park. But when he learned that Hammond had done, it was impossible to pass up. Harding had an academic bent, and the prospect of writing the first textbook of veterinary internal medicine, Diseases of Dinosauria, was compelling. In the late 20th century, veterinary medicine was scientifically advanced. The best zoos ran clinics little different from hospitals. New textbooks were merely refinements of old. For a world-class practitioner, there were no worlds left to conquer. But to be the first to care for a whole new class of animals, that was something. And Harding had never regretted his decision.
He had developed considerable expertise with these animals, and he didn't want to hear from Hammond now. The Hipsy snorted and twitched. She was still breathing, shallowly. There was no ocular reflex yet, but it was time to get moving. "All aboard!" Harding shouted. "Let's get this girl back to her paddock." Living systems, Arnold said, are not like mechanical systems. Living systems are never in equilibrium. They're inherently unstable. They may seem stable, but they're not. Everything is moving and changing. In a sense, everything is on the edge of collapse. Gennaro was frowning. "But lots of things don't change. Body temperature doesn't change. All kinds of other... Body temperature changes constantly," Arnold said. "Constantly. It changes cyclically over 24 hours. Lowest in the morning, highest in the afternoon. It changes with mood, with disease, with exercise, with outside temperature, with food. It continuously fluctuates up and down, tiny jiggles on a graph, because at any moment, some other forces are pushing temperature up, and other forces are pulling it down. It is inherently unstable, and every other aspect of living systems is like that too." "So, you're saying..." "Malcolm's just another theoretician," Arnold said. "Sitting in his office, he made a nice mathematical model, and it never occurred to him that what he saw as defects were actually necessities. Look, when I was working on missiles, we dealt with something called resonant yaw. Resonant yaw meant that even though a missile was only slightly unstable off the pad, it was hopeless. It was inevitably going to go out of control. It wouldn't be brought back. That's a feature of mechanical systems. A little wobble can get worse until the whole system collapses. But those same little wobbles are essential to a living system. They mean the system is healthy and responsive. Malcolm never understood that." "Are you sure he didn't understand that? He seems pretty clear on the difference between living and non-living." "Look," Arnold said, "the proof is right here." He pointed to the screens. "In less than an hour," he said, "the park will be all back online. The only thing I've got left to clear is the telephones. For some reason, they're still out. But everything else will be working. And that's not theoretical. That's fact." The needle went deep into the neck, and Harding injected the medrin into the anesthetized female dryosaur as she lay on her side on the ground. Immediately the animal began to recover, snorting and kicking her powerful hind legs. "Back, everybody," Harding said, scrambling away. "Get back!" The dinosaur staggered to her feet, standing drunkenly. She shook her lizard head, staring at the people standing back in the quartz lights, and blinked. "She's drooling," Hammond said, worried. "Temporary," Harding said. "It'll stop." The dryosaur coughed, and then moved slowly across the field, away from the lights. "Why isn't she hopping?" "Oh, she will," Harding said. "It'll take her about an hour to recover fully. She's fine." He turned back to the car. "Okay, boys, let's go deal with the stego." Muldoon watched as the last of the stakes was pounded into the ground. The lines were pulled taut, and the protocarpus tree was lifted clear. Muldoon could see the blackened, charred streaks on the silver fence where the short had occurred. At the base of the fence, several ceramic insulators had burst. They would have to be replaced. Before that could be done, Arnold had to shut down all the fences. "Control, this is Muldoon. We're ready to begin repair." "All right," Arnold said. "Shutting onto the section now." Muldoon glanced at his watch. Somewhere in the distance, he heard soft hooting. It sounded like owls, but he knew it was the Dilophosaurs. He went over to Ramon and said, "Let's finish this up. I want to get to those other sections of fence." An hour went by. Donald Gennaro stared at the glowing mapping in the control room as the spots of numbers flicked and changed. "What's happening now?" Arnold worked at the console. "Trying to get the phones back so we can call about Malcolm." "No, I mean out there." Arnold glanced up at the board. "Looks as if they've done with the animals in 2 sections, just as I told you. The park is back in hand, with no catastrophic Malcolm effect. In fact, there's just the 3rd section of the fence." "Arnold," was Muldoon's voice. "Yes?" "Have you seen this bloody fence?" "Just a minute." On one of the monitors, Gennaro saw the high angle down on a field of grass, blowing in the wind. In the distance was a low concrete roof. "That's the sauropod maintenance building," Arnold explained. "It's one of the utility structures we use for equipment, feed storage, and so on. We had them all over the park in each of the paddocks. On the monitor, the video image panned. We're turning the camera now to get a look at the fence. Gennaro saw a shining wall of metallic mesh on the light. One section had been trampled, knocked flat. Muldoon's jeep and work crew were there. Huh, Arnold said. Looks like the Rex went to the sauropod paddock. Muldoon said, fine dining tonight. Well, we'll have to get them out of there, Arnold said. With what? Muldoon said. We haven't got anything to use on a Rex. We'll fix this fence, but I'm not going in with until daylight. Hammond won't like that. We'll discuss it when I get back, Muldoon said. How many sauropods will the Rex kill? Hammond said, pacing around the control room. Probably just one, Harding said. Sauropods are big. The Rex can feed off a single kill for several days. We have to go out and get him tonight, Hammond said. Muldoon shook his head. Not going in there until daylight. Hammond was rising up and down on the balls of his feet, the way he did whenever he was angry. Are you forgetting you work for me? No, Mr. Hammond, I'm not forgetting. But that's a full-grown adult Tyrannosaur out there. How do you plan to get him? We have tranquilizer guns. We have tranquilizer guns that shoot a 20cc dot, Muldoon said. Fine for an animal that weighs 400 or 500 pounds, but that Tyrannosaur weighs 8 tons. It wouldn't even feel it. You ordered a larger weapon. I ordered 3 larger weapons, Mr. Hammond. But you cut the requisition so we got only one. And it's gone. Nedry took it when he left. That was pretty stupid. Who let that happen? Nedry's not my problem, Mr. Hammond, Muldoon said. You're saying, Hammond said, that as of this moment, there's no way to stop the Tyrannosaur. That's exactly what I'm saying, Muldoon said. That's ridiculous, Hammond said. It's your park, Mr. Hammond. You didn't want anybody to be able to injure your precious dinosaurs. Well, now you've got a Rex in there with the sauropods, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. He left the room. Just a minute, Hammond said, hurrying after him. Gennaro stared at the screens and listened to the shouted argument in the hallway outside. He said to Arnold, Guess you don't have control of the park yet after all. Don't kid yourself, Arnold said, lighting another cigarette. We have the park. They'll be done in a couple of hours. We may lose a couple of dinos before we get the Rex out there, but believe me, we have the park. Dawn. Grant was awakened by a loud grinding sound, followed by a mechanical clanking. He opened his eyes and saw a bale of hay rolling past him on a conveyor belt, up towards the ceiling. 2 more bales followed it. Then the clanking stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and the concrete building was silent again. Grant yawned. He stretched sleepily, winced in pain, and sat up. Soft yellow light came through the side windows. It was morning. He had slept the whole night. He looked quickly at his watch. 5 a.m. Still almost 6 hours to go before the boat had been recalled. He rolled onto his back, groaning. His head throbbed and his body ached as if he had been beaten up. From around the corner he heard a squeaking sound, like a rusty wheel, and then Lex giggling. Grant stood slowly and looked at the building. Now that it was daylight, he could see that it was some kind of a maintenance building with stacks of hay supplies. On the wall he saw a gray metal box and a stenciled sign, Sauropod Maintenance Building 04. This must be the sauropod paddock, as he had thought. He opened the box and saw a telephone. But when he lifted the receiver, he heard only hissing static. Apparently the phones weren't working yet. Chew your food, Lex was saying. Don't be a piggy, Ralph. Grant walked around the corner and found Lex by the bars, holding out handfuls of hay to an animal outside that looked like a large pink pig and was making the squeaking sounds Grant had heard. It was actually an infinite triceratops, about the size of a pony. The infinite didn't have horns on his head yet, just a curved bony frill behind big soft eyes. It poked its snout through the bars toward Lex, its eyes watching her as she fed it more hay. That's better, Lex said. There's plenty of hay, don't worry. She patted the baby on the head. You like hay, don't you, Ralph? Lex turned back and saw him. This is Ralph, Lex said. He's my friend. He likes hay. Grant took a step and stopped, wincing. You look pretty bad, Lex said. I feel pretty bad. Tim, too. His nose is all swollen up. Where's Tim? Ping, she said. You want to help me feed Ralph? The baby triceratops looked at Grant. The hay stuck out of both sides of its mouth, dropping on the floor as it chewed. He's a very messy eater, Lex said. He's very hungry. The baby finished chewing and licked its lips. It opened its mouth, waiting for more. Grant could see the slender, sharp teeth and the beaky upper jaw like a parrot. Okay, just a minute, Lex said, scooping up more straw from the concrete floor. Honestly, Ralph, she said, you think your mother never fed you. Why is his name Ralph? 'Cause he looks like Ralph at school. Grant came closer and touched the skin of the neck gently. It's okay, you can pet him, Lex said. He likes it when you pet him, don't you, Ralph? The skin felt dry and warm, with the pebbled texture of a football. Ralph gave a little squeak as Grant petted it. Outside the bars, its thick tail swung back and forth with pleasure. He's pretty tame. Ralph looked from Lex to Grant as it ate, and showed no sign of fear. It reminded Grant that the dinosaurs didn't have ordinary responses to people. Maybe I can ride him, Lex said. Let's not. I bet he'd let me, Lex said. It'd be fun to ride a dinosaur. Grant looked out the bars past the animal, to the open fields of the sauropod compound. It was growing lighter every minute. He should go outside, he thought, and set off one of the motion sensors on the field above. After all, it might take people in the control room an hour to get out here to him, and he didn't like the idea that the phones were still down. He heard a deep snorting sound, like the snort of a very large horse, and suddenly the baby became agitated. It tried to pull its head back through the bars, but got caught in the edge of the frill. It squeaked in fright. The snorting came again. It was closer this time. Ralph reared up on its hind legs, frantic to get out from between the bars. It wriggled its head back and forth, rubbing against the bars. Ralph, take it easy, Lex said. Push him out, Grant said. He reached up to Ralph's head and leaned against it, pushing the animal sideways and backward. The frill popped free and the baby fell outside the bars, losing its balance and flopping on its side. Even the baby was covered in shadow, and a huge leg came into view, thicker than a tree trunk. The foot had 5 curved toenails, like an elephant's. Ralph looked up and squeaked. A head came down into view 6 feet long, with 3 long white horns, one above each of the large brown eyes and a smaller horn at the tip of the nose. It was a full-grown triceratops. The big animal peered at Lex and Grant, blinking slowly, and then turned its attention to Ralph. A tongue came out and licked the baby. Ralph squeaked and rubbed up against the big leg happily. Is that his mom? Lex said. Looks like it, Grant said. Should we feed the mom too? Lex said. But the big triceratops was already nudging Ralph with her snout, pushing the baby away from the bars. Guess not. The infant turned away from the bars and walked off. From time to time, the big mother nudged her baby, guiding it away as they both walked out into the fields. Goodbye, Ralph, Lex said, waving. Tim came out of the shadows of the building. Tell you what, Grant said. I'm going up the hill to set off the motion sensors, so they'll know to come get us. You two stay here and wait for me. No, Lex said. Why? Stay here. It's safe here. You're not leaving us, she said. Right, Timmy? Right, Tim said. Okay, Grant said. They crawled through the bars, stepping outside. It was just before dawn. The air was warm and humid. The sky soft pink and purple. The white mist clung low to the ground. Some distance away, they saw the mother triceratops and the baby moving away toward the herd of large, duck-billed hadrosaurs, eating foliage from the trees at the edge of the lagoon. Some of the hadrosaurs stood knee-deep in the water. They drank, lowering their flat heads, meeting their own reflections in the still water. Then they looked up again, their heads swiveling. At the water's edge, one of the babies ventured out, squeaked, and scrambled back while the adults watched indulgently. Farther south, other hadrosaurs were eating the lower vegetation. Sometimes they reared up on their hind legs, resting their forelegs on the tree trunks so they could reach the leaves and higher branches. And in the far distance, a giant apatosaur stood above the trees, and tiny heads swiveling on the long neck. The scene was so peaceful, Grant found it hard to imagine any danger. Yow! Lex shouted, ducking. 2 giant red dragonflies with 6-foot wingspans hummed past them. What was that? Dragonflies, he said. The Jurassic was a time of huge insects.
Do they bite? Lex said.
I don't think so, Grant said.
Tim held out his hand.
One of the dragonflies lighted on it. He could feel the weight of the
Huge insect. He's gonna bite you, Lex warned.
But the dragonfly just slowly flapped its red-veined transparent wings, and then, when Tim moved his arm,
flew off again. Which way do they go? Lex said.
There.
They started walking across the field. They reached a black box mounted on the heavy metal tripod, the first of the motion sensors. Grant stopped and waved his hand in front of it, back and forth. But nothing happened. If the phones didn't work, perhaps the sensors didn't work either.
We'll try another one, he said,
pointing across the field. Somewhere in the distance, they heard the roar of a large animal. Oh, hell, Arnold said. I just can't find it. He sipped coffee and stared bleary-eyed at the screens. He had taken all the video monitors offline. In the control room, he was searching the computer code. He was exhausted. He'd been working for 12 straight hours. He turned to Wu, who had come up from the lab.
Find what? The phones are still out. I can't get them back on. I think Nedry did something to the phones.
Wu lifted one phone, hearing hissing.
Sounds like a modem. But it's not, Arnold said, because I went down to the basement and shut off all the modems. What you're hearing is just white noise that sounds like a modem transmitting.
So, the phone lines are jammed?
Basically, yeah. Nedry jammed all of them very well. He's inserted some kind of lockout into the program code, and now I can't find it because I gave that restore command which erased part of the program listings. But apparently the command to shut off the phones is still resident to the computer memory. Wu shrugged. So, just reset. Shut the system down and you'll clear memory. I've never done it before, Arnold said. And I'm reluctant to do it. Maybe all the systems will come back and start up, but maybe they won't. I'm not a computer expert, and neither are you. Not really, not with that. And without an open phone line, we can't talk to anybody who is. Oh my god, they could have fixed this if they just forced an unexpected reboot. If the command is RAM resident, it won't show up in the code. You could do a RAM dump and search that, but you know what you're searching for. I think all you could do is reset. Janora stormed in. We still don't have any telephones. Working on it. You've been working on it since midnight, and Malcolm is worse. He needs medical attention. It means I'll have to shut down, Arnold said. I can't be sure everything will come back on. Janara said, Look, there's a sick man over in that lodge. He needs a doctor or he'll die. You can't call for a doctor unless you have a phone. 4 people have probably died already. Now shut down and get those phones working. Arnold hesitated. Well, Janara said. Well, it's just the safety systems don't allow the computer to be shut down and... Then turn the goddamn safety systems off. Can't you get it through your head that we're going to die unless it gets help? Okay, Arnold said. He got up and went to the main panel. He opened the doors and uncovered the metal swing latches over the safety switches. He popped them off, one after another. You asked for it, Arnold said. And you got it. He threw the master switch. The control room was dark. All the monitors were black, and 3 men stood there in the dark. How long do we have to wait? Janara said. 30 seconds, Arnold said.
P.U., Lex said as they crossed the field.
What?
That smell, Lex said. It stinks like rotten garbage.
Grant hesitated. He stared across the field toward the distant trees, looking for movement. He saw nothing. There was hardly a breeze to stir the branches. It was peaceful and silent in the early morning. I think it's your imagination, he said.
It's not.
Then he heard the honking sound. It came from the herd of duckbill hadrosaurs behind them. First one animal, then another, and another, until the whole herd had taken up the honking cry. The duckbills were agitated, twisting and turning, hurrying out of the water, circling the young ones to protect them. They smell it too, Grant thought. With a roar, the Tyrannosaur burst from the trees 50 yards away near the lagoon. It rushed out across the open field with huge strides. It ignored them, heading toward the herd of hadrosaurs. I told you, Lex screamed. Nobody listens to me. In the distance, the duckbills were honking and started to run. Grant could feel the earth shake beneath his feet. Come on, kids. He grabbed Lex, lifting her bodily off the ground, and ran with Tim through the grass. He had glimpses of the Tyrannosaur down by the lagoon, lunging at the Hadrosaurs, which swung their big tails in defense and honked loudly and continuously. He heard the crashing of foliage and trees, and where he looked again, the duckbills were charging. In the darkened control room, Arnold checked his watch. 30 seconds. The memory should be cleared by now. He pushed the main power switch back on. Nothing happened. Arnold's stomach heaved. He pushed the switch off, then on again. Still nothing happened. He felt sweat on his brow. "What's wrong?" Gennaro said. "Oh, hell," Arnold said. Then he remembered they had to turn the safety switches back on before he restarted the power. He flipped on the 3 safeties and covered them again with the latch covers. Then he held his breath and turned the main power switch. The room lights came on. The computers beeped. The screens hummed. "Thank God," Arnold said. He hurried to the main monitor. There were 4 rows of labels on the screen. Gennaro reached for the phone, but it was dead. No static hissing this time, just nothing at all. "What's this?" "Give me a second," Arnold said. "I have to reset all the system modules that he brought back online manually." Quickly, he went back to work. "Why manually?" Gennaro said. "We just let me work, for Christ's sake." Wu said, "The system was not intended to ever shut down, so if it does shut down, it assumes that there is a problem somewhere. It requires you to start up everything manually. Otherwise, if there's a short somewhere, the system can start up, short out, start up again, short out again, in an endless cycle." "Okay," Arnold said. "We're going..." Gennaro picked up the phone and started to dial, when he suddenly stopped. "Jesus, look at that," he said. He pointed to one of the video monitors. But Arnold wasn't listening. He was staring at the map, where the tight cluster of dots by the lagoon had started to move in a coordinated way, moving fast, in a kind of swirl. "What's happening?" Gennaro said. "The duckbills," Arnold said tonelessly. "They've stampeded." The duckbills charged with surprising speed. Their enormous bodies in a tight cluster, honking and roaring. The infants squealed and trying to stay up from underfoot. The herd raised a great cloud of yellow dust. Grant couldn't see the Tyrannosaur. The duckbills were running right toward them. Still carrying Lex, he ran with Tim toward the rocky outcrop. With a stand of big conifers, they ran hard, feeling the ground shake beneath their feet. The sound of the approaching herd was deafening, like the sound of jets at an airport. It filled the air and hurt their ears. Lex was shouting something, but he couldn't hear what she was saying, and as they scrambled onto the rocks, the herd closed in around them. Grant saw the immense legs of the first hadrosaurs that charged past, each animal weighing 5 tons, and then they were enveloped in a cloud so dense he could see nothing at all. He had the impression of huge bodies, giant limbs, bellowing cries of pain, and the animals wheeled and circled. One duckbill struck a boulder and it rolled past them onto the field beyond. In the dense cloud of dust, they could see almost nothing beyond the rocks. They clung to their boulders, listening to the screams and honks, the menacing roar of the Tyrannosaur. Lex dug her fingers into Grant's shoulder. Another hadrosaur slammed its big tail against the rocks, leaving a splash of hot blood. Grant waited until the sounds of the fighting had moved off to the left, and then he pushed the kids to start climbing the largest tree. They climbed swiftly, feeling for the branches as the animals stamped all around them in the dust. They went up 20 feet, and then Lex clutched at Grant and refused to go farther. Tim was tired too, and Grant thought they were high enough. Through the dust, they could see the broad backs of the animals below as they wheeled and honked. Grant propped himself against the coarse bark of the trunk, coughed in the dust, closed his eyes, and waited. Arnold adjusted the camera as the herd moved away. The dust slowly cleared. He saw that the hadrosaurs had scattered, and the Tyrannosaur had stopped running, which could only mean it had made a kill. The Tyrannosaur was now near the lagoon. Arnold looked at the video monitor and said, "Better get Muldoon out there and see how bad it is." "I'll get him," Gennaro said, and left the room.
The park. A faint crackling sound, like the fire in a fireplace. Something warm and wet tickled Grant's ankle. He opened his eyes and saw an enormous beige head. The head tapered to a flat mouth shaped like a bill of a duck. The eyes, protruding above the flat duckbill, were gentle and soft like a cow's. The duck mouth opened and chewed branches of a limb where Grant was sitting. He saw large flat teeth in the cheek. The warm lips touched his ankle again as the animal chewed. A duck-billed hadrosaur. He was astonished to see it up close. Not that he was afraid. All the species of duck-billed hadrosaurs were herbivores, and this one acted exactly like a cow. Even though it was huge, its manner was so calm and peaceful, Grant didn't feel threatened. He stayed where he was on the branch, careful not to move, and watched as it ate. The reason Grant was astonished was that he had proprietary feelings about this animal. It was probably a myosaur from the late Cretaceous in Montana. With John Horner, Grant had been the first to describe the species. Myosaurs had an upcurved lip, which gave them the appearance of smiling. The name meant good mother lizard. Myosaurs were thought to protect their eggs until the babies were born and can take care of themselves. Grant heard an insistent chirping, and the big head swung down. He moved just enough to see the baby hadrosaur scampering around the feet of the adult. The baby was dark beige with black spots. The adult bent her head low to the ground and waited, unmoving, while the baby stood up on its hind legs, resting its front legs on the mother's jaw, and ate the branches that protruded from the side of the mother's mouth. The mother waited patiently until the baby had finished eating, and dropped back down to all fours again. Then the big head came back up toward Grant. The hadrosaur continued to eat, just a few feet from him. Grant looked at the two elongated air holes on the top of the flat upper bill. Apparently, the dinosaur couldn't smell Grant, and even though the left eye was looking right at him, for some reason the hadrosaur didn't react to him. He remembered how the Tyrannosaur had failed to see him the previous night. Grant decided on an experiment. He coughed. Instantly the hadrosaur froze, the big head suddenly still, the jaws no longer chewing. Only the eye moved, looking for the source of the sound. Then after a moment, when there seemed to be no danger, the animal resumed chewing. Amazing, Grant thought. Sitting in his arms, Lex opened her eyes and said, "Hey, what's that?" The hadrosaur trumpeted in alarm, a loud resonant honk that so startled Lex that she nearly fell out of the tree. The hadrosaur pulled its head away from the branch and trumpeted again. "Don't make her mad," Tim said from the branch above. The baby chirped and scurried beneath the mother's leg as the hadrosaur stepped away from the tree. The mother cocked her head and peered inquisitively at the branch Grant and Lex were sitting. With its upturned, smiling lips, the dinosaur had a comical appearance. "Is it dumb?" Lex said. "No," Grant said. "You just surprised her." "Well," Lex said, "is she going to let us down or what?" The hadrosaur had backed 10 feet away from the tree. She honked again. Grant had the impression she was trying to frighten them away. But the dinosaur didn't really know what to do. She acted confused and uneasy. They waited in silence, and after a minute the hadrosaur approached the branch again, jaws moving in anticipation. She was clearly going to resume eating. "Forget it," Lex said. "I'm not staying here." She started to climb down in the branches. At her movement, the hadrosaur trumpeted in fresh alarm. Grant was amazed. He thought, "It really can't see us when we don't move. And after a minute, it literally forgets that we're here." This was just like the Tyrannosaur, another classic example of the amphibian visual cortex. Studies of frogs had shown that amphibians only saw moving things, like insects. If something didn't move, they literally didn't see it. The same thing seemed to be true of dinosaurs. In any case, the myosaur now seemed to find these strange creatures climbing down the tree too upsetting. With a final honk, she nudged her baby and lumbered slowly away. She paused once and looked back at them, then continued on. They reached the ground. Lex shook herself off. Both children were covered in a layer of fine dust. All around them the grass had been flattened. There were streaks of blood and a sour smell. Grant looked at his watch. "We better get going, kids," he said. "Not me," Lex said. "I'm not walking out there anymore." "We have to." "Why?" "Because," Grant said, "we have to tell them about the boat. Since they can't see us on the motion sensors, we have to go all the way back ourselves. It's the only way." "Why can't we take the raft?" Tim said. "What raft?" Tim pointed to the low concrete maintenance building with the bars, where they had spent the night. It was 20 yards away, across the field. "I saw a raft back there," he said. Grant immediately understood the advantages. It was now 7 o'clock in the morning. They had at least 8 miles to go. If they could take a raft along the river, they could make it much faster progress than going overland. "Let's do it," Grant said. Arnold punched the visual search mode and watched as monitors began to scan throughout the park, the images changing every 2 seconds. It was tiring to watch, but it was the fastest way to find Nedry's Jeep, and Muldoon had been adamant about that. He had gone out with Gennaro to look at the stampede, but now that it was daylight, he wanted the car found. He wanted the weapons. His intercom clicked. "Mr. Arnold, may I have a word with you, please?" It was Hammond. He sounded like the voice of God. "You want me to come here, Mr. Armand?" "No, Mr. Arnold," Hammond said. "Come to me. I'm in the genetics lab with Dr. Wu. We'll be waiting for you." Arnold sighed and stepped away from the screens. Grant stumbled deep in the gloomy recesses of the building. He pushed past 5-gallon containers of herbicide, tree pruning equipment, spare tires for a Jeep, coils of cyclone fencing, 100-pound fertilizer bags, stacks of brown ceramic insulators, empty motor oil cans, work lights, and cables. "I don't see any raft." "Keep going." Bags of cement, lengths of copper pipe, green mesh, and 2 plastic oars hung on clips of the concrete wall. "Okay," he said, "but where's the raft?" "It must be here somewhere," Tim said. "You never saw a raft?" "No, I just assumed it was here." Poking among the junk, Grant found no raft. But he did find a set of plans rolled up and speckled with mold from humidity. Stuck back in the metal cabinet of the wall, he spread the plans on the floor, brushing away a big spider. He looked at them for a long time. "I'm hungry." "Just a minute." They were detailed topographical charts for the main area of the island, where they now were. According to this, the lagoon narrowed into the river where they'd seen earlier, which twisted northward, right through the aviary, and onto within a half-mile of the visitor lodge. He flipped back through the pages. How to get to the lagoon? According to the plans, there should be a door at the back of the building they were in. Grant looked up and saw it. Recessed back into the concrete wall, the door was wide enough for a car. Opening it, he saw a paved road running straight down toward the lagoon. The road was dug below ground level, so it couldn't be seen from above. It must be another service road, and it led to a dock at the edge of the lagoon, and clearly stenciled on the dock was raft storage. "Hey," Tim said, "look at this." He held a metal case to Grant. Opening it, Grant found a compressed air pistol and a cloth belt that held darts. There were 6 darts in all, each as thick as his finger, labeled Morrow 709. "Good work, Tim." He slung the belt around his shoulder and stuck the gun in his trousers. "Is it a tranquilizer gun?" "I'd say so." "What about the boat?" Lex said. "I think it's on the dock," Grant said. They started down the road. Grant carried the oars on his shoulder. "I hope it's a big raft," Lex said, "because I can't swim." "Don't worry," he said. "Maybe we can catch some fish," she said. They walked down the road with the sloping embankment rising up on both sides of them. They heard a deep, rhythmic snorting sound, but Grant could not see where it was coming from. "Are you sure there's a raft down here?" Lex said, wrinkling her nose. "Probably," Grant said. The rhythmic snorting became louder as they walked, but they also heard a steady droning, buzzing sound. When they reached the end of the road, at the edge of the small concrete dock, Grant froze in shock. The Tyrannosaur was right there. It was sitting upright in the shade of a tree. Its hind legs stretched out in front. Its eyes were open, but it was not moving, except for its head, which lifted and fell gently with each snorting sound. The buzzing came from the clouds of flies that surrounded it, crawling over its face and slack jaws, its bloody fangs and the red haunch of a killed hadrosaur that lay on its side behind the Tyrannosaur. The Tyrannosaur was only 20 yards away. Grant felt sure it must have seen him, but the big animal did not respond. It just sat there. It took a moment to realize the Tyrannosaur was asleep. Sitting up, but asleep. He signaled to Tim and Lex to stay here where they were. Grant walked slowly forward onto the dock. In full view of the Tyrannosaur, the big animal continued to sleep, snoring softly. Near the end of the dock, A wooden shed was painted green to blend with the foliage. Grant quietly unlatched the door and looked inside. He saw half a dozen orange life vests hanging on the wall, several rolls of wire mesh fencing, some coils of rope, and 2 big rubber cubes sitting on the floor. The cubes were strapped tight with flat rubber belts. Rafts. He looked back at Lex. She mouthed, "No boat." He nodded, "Yes." The Tyrannosaur raised its forelimb to swipe at the flies buzzing around his snout, but otherwise it did not move. Grant pulled one of the cubes out onto the dock. It was surprisingly heavy. He freed the straps, found the inflation cylinder. With a loud hiss, the rubber began to expand, and then with a hiss, whap, it popped fully. Open on the dock, the sound was fearfully loud in their ears. Grant turned, stared up at the dinosaur. The Tyrannosaur grunted and snorted. It began to move. Grant braced himself to run, but the animal shifted its ponderous bulk, and then it settled back against the tree trunk and gave a long, growling belch. Lex looked disgusted, waving her hand in front of her face. Grant was soaked in sweat from the tension. He dragged the rubber raft across the dock. It flopped onto the water with a loud splash. The dinosaur continued to sleep. Grant tied the boat up to the dock and returned to the shed to take out the 2 life preservers. He put these in the boat and then waved for the kids to come out onto the dock. Pale with fear, Lex waved back, "No." He gestured, "Yes." The Tyrannosaur continued to sleep. Grant stabbed in the air with an emphatic finger. Lex came silently, and he gestured for her to get into the raft. Then Tim got in, and they both put on their life vests. Grant got in and pushed off. The raft drifted silently onto the lagoon. Grant picked up his paddles and fitted them into the oar locks. They moved farther from the dock. Lex sat back and sighed loudly with relief. Then she looked stricken and put her hand over her mouth. Her body shook with muffled sounds. She was suppressing a cough. She always coughed at the wrong times. "Lex!" Tim whispered fiercely, looking back toward the shore. She shook her head miserably and pointed to her throat. He knew what that meant. A tickle in her throat. What she needed was a drink of water. Grant was rowing, and Tim leaned over the side of the raft and scooped his hand on the lagoon, holding his cupped hand toward her. Lex coughed loudly, explosively. In Tim's ears, the sound echoed across the water like a gunshot. The Tyrannosaur yawned lazily and scratched behind its ear with its hind foot, just like a dog. It yawned again. It was groggy after its big meal, and it woke up slowly. On the boat, Lex was making little gargling sounds. "Lex, shut up!" Tim said. "Can't help it," she whispered, and then she coughed again. Grant rowed hard, moving the raft powerfully onto the center of the lagoon. On the shore, the Tyrannosaur stumbled to its feet. "I couldn't help it, Timmy!" she shrieked miserably. "I couldn't help it!" "Shh!" Grant was rowing as fast as he could. "Anyway, it doesn't matter," she said. "We're far enough away. He can't swim." "Of course he can swim, you little idiot!" Tim shouted at her. On the shore, the Tyrannosaur stepped off the dock and plunged into the water. It moved strongly into the lagoon after them. "Well, how should I know?" she said. "Everybody knows Tyrannosaurs can swim. It's in all the books. Anyway, all reptiles can swim." "Snakes can't? Of course snakes can, you idiot!" "Settle down," Grant said. "Hold on to something." Grant was noticing the Tyrannosaur noticing how the animal swam. The Tyrannosaur was now chest deep in the water, but it could hold its big head high above the surface. When Grant realized the animal wasn't swimming, it was walking. Because moments later, only the very top of the head, the eyes, and nostrils protruded above the surface. By then it looked like a crocodile, and it swam like a crocodile, swinging its big tail back and forth. So the animal churned behind it, behind the head. Grant saw the hump of the back, and the ridges along the length of the tail, as it occasionally broke the surface. Exactly like a crocodile, he thought unhappily. The biggest crocodile in the world. "I'm sorry, Dr. Grant," Lex wailed. "I didn't mean it." Grant glanced over his shoulder. The lagoon was no more than 100 yards wide here, and they had almost reached the center. If he continued, the water would become shallow again. The Tyrannosaur would be able to walk again, and he would move faster in the shallow water. Grant swung the boat around and began to row north. "What are you doing?" The Tyrannosaur was now just a few yards away. Grant could hear its sharp snorting breaths as it came closer. Grant looked at the paddles in his hands, but they were light plastic, not weapons at all. The Tyrannosaur threw its head back and opened its jaws wide, showing rows of curved teeth, and then in a great muscular spasm lunged forward to the raft, just missing the rubber gunwale, the huge skull slapping down and the raft rocking away on the crest of the splash. The Tyrannosaur sank below the surface, leaving gurgling bubbles. The lagoon was still. Lex gripped the gunwale handles and looked back. "Did he drown?" "No," Grant said. He saw the bubbles, then a faint ripple along the surface coming toward the boat. "Hang on!" he shouted as the head bucked up beneath the rubber, bending the boat and lifting it into the air, spinning them crazily before it splashed down again. "Do something!" Alexis screamed. "Do something!" Grant pulled the air pistol out of his belt. It looked pitifully small in his hands, but there was a chance that if the shot the animal in a sensitive spot, in the eye or the nose, the Tyrannosaur surfaced beside the boat, opened its jaws and roared. Grant aimed and fired. The dart flashed, and in the light, smacked into the cheek. The Tyrannosaur shook its head and roared again. And suddenly they heard an answering roar, floating across the water toward them. Looking back, Grant saw the juvenile T-Rex on the shore, crouching over the killed sauropod, claiming the kill as its own. The juvenile splashed at the carcass, then raised its head high and bellowed. The big Tyrannosaur saw it too, and the response was immediate. It turned back to protect its kill, swimming strongly toward the shore. "He's going away!" Lick squealed, clapping her hands. "He's going away! Na 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 na! Stupid dinosaur!" From the shore, the juvenile roared defiantly. Enraged, the big Tyrannosaur burst on the lagoon at full speed, water streaming from its enormous body as it raced up the hill past the dock. The juvenile ducked its head and fled, its jaws still filled with ragged flesh. The big Tyrannosaur chased it, raced past the dead sauropod. Disappearing over the hill, they heard its final threatening bellow, and then the raft moved on to the north. Around the bed in the lagoon, to the river. Exhausted from rowing, Grant collapsed back, his chest heaving. He couldn't catch his breath. He lay gasping in the raft. "Are you okay, Dr. Grant?" Lex asked. "From now on, will you just do what I tell you?" "Okay," she sighed, as if he just made the most unreasonable demand in the world. She trailed her arm in the water for a while. "You stopped rowing," she said. "I'm tired," Grant said. "Then how come we're still moving?" Grant sat up. She was right. The raft drifted steadily north. There must be a current. The current was carrying them north, toward the hotel. He looked at his watch and was astonished to see it was 15 minutes past 7. Only 15 minutes had passed since he had last looked at his watch. It seemed like 2 hours. Grant lay back against the rubber gunwales, closed his eyes, and slept. End of 4th iteration.